You know that Dostoevsky saying, right? Is that your sin is that you destroyed yourself for nothing?
Yep.
He was absolutely right. What we did is we sold ourselves to the industrialists, and then the industrialists put a regime and a machine in place to manage us. It's just all government is labor management. That's all it is, and it's horrible at it.
Let's go.
Welcome to Citizen. We got a special guest today again for the second time, EM Burlingame, former Green Beret. And how would you describe yourself now?
Author, probably more than anything else. Author and researcher. Yeah.
And we'll get into some of that here pretty soon. But what have you been researching lately?
Well, we're working on high energetic medicine, what we call third gen med, moving beyond biomolecular medicine to direct bioelectric. Tufts University's got Dr. Michael Levin. There's Nick Lane over in UK and some others that are doing the fundamental lab work, but we already have doctors that are, practicing. So that's what we're looking at now is how do we use photonics and electrical current to impact, cellular systems, cellular structures, processes, neurologic disorders, et cetera.
I think some people might remember a story about this from back in the day where people that were experiencing cross-synaptic firing, electrical currents were used to regulate their brain again. In the same way that an AED regulates your heart rate. It's like kind of the same principle. We're just big batteries, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I would say two things. We are made up of 400 or 500 trillion small little batteries, so we're more of a battery pack.
Okay.
And, we're a dipole magnet from top of the head and the bottom of the feet. So we're also a, very substantial magnet, bioelectric, electromagnetism magnet.
Now, explain to me photonics and high energetic medicine. Give me some practical examples of the conditions you would treat and the treatment and what the treatment actually does, if you can.
Yeah, so the easy ones, of course, are neuropathy and nerve damage, and how do you stimulate, nerve growth or regrowth, connectivity, myelination, strengthening of the connection, muscle-brain synapse reconnections, and those types of things. But other things that are more impactful and far more beneficial are changing the, using electrical currents and very sophisticated electronics to identify electrical impedance in different parts of the world where the electromagnetic field isn't functioning properly, and then adapting the frequency ranges in very sophisticated ways to remove that bioelectric blockage, which which forces a biomolecular shift and adjust. So that current is flowing. And then what you find is, liver problem, in some instances, people are having liver problems, kidney problems, neurologic problems, et cetera. To do that, what's happening, one little piece, what's happening there primarily is that the electrical charge on the cell wall is being restored to something healthy, which then that cell in the community of millions of cells or trillions and billions of cells around it can function properly.
Does that metastasize? Is there a critical mass of cells in a local region that you can put back on the right, let's call it wavelength or polarity? I don't know what phrase you would use that would affect the greater mass.
Yeah, so great question. So what we find is that you introduce the current generally to the dermis, right, to the skin. So let me take a step back a little bit. So with more and more precision, we realize that different cellular communities, tissue types, right? So liver tissues versus kidney tissues versus heart muscle tissues versus connective tissues work on different frequency pairs. You know, the whole Tesla thing, right? The alternating current thing. He wasn't so wrong about that. We can introduce, so the whole purpose of biomolecular processes and systems and structures inside the cell and across cells is to maintain and fluctuate these bioelectric fields on the cell wall, within inside the cell, between boundary conditions within the cells and between cells, et cetera. Over time, those cells, through noise, basically, or, you know, which is either nutritional noise, toxicity, time, heat, thermal, injury, et cetera, they get all out of balance and they're not maintaining exactly the right field, right? The exact frequency pairs. So what we find with one like frequency specific microcurrent is you can introduce that proper frequency pair anywhere. Generally, you want to get it as close to what you're trying to impact as possible. But you introduce that current to the outside, what it does is the cell systems recognize, like a tuning, right? Recognize and go, oh yeah, that's what we're supposed to be tuning towards. That's the frequency range. The cells get free energy at the frequency ranges that they're supposed to be producing energy. And so what do? They are reminded of, oh, yep, this is what we're supposed to be tuning for. Let's fix that. And they get the free energy. So once they get the free energy, what do? They go immediately into repair mode.
Is there, this is just kind of an aside, but curiosity of mine. Those frequency sound engines, do they have any effect on this? Like that, the Hatch device has something that you play when you're falling to sleep and sleeping. It's at 432 megahertz, and there's a reason for it to make your brain go into a relaxive state. Is there anything about just sound and not direct, like current right through you, that has any effect on that? Because it is, I mean, sound is a wave of vibrations, just like light and everything else, right? That's what energy is. So I'm curious about that.
Yeah. So anything from the subvisual and subaural, right, to, you know, going the other way where it's too high frequency, you know, so too low an energetic frequency for us to consciously pick up is still impactful, whatever that is: sound, light, electricity, pressure, right? Like hyperbarics, when you get in, it's not just the oxygenation, it's the pressure as well. Yeah. Those are all just different ways of expressing energy distributions, application of energy, et cetera. So yes, it does help. The one thing we find with audio in particular is that is the oldest sense amongst single-cell communities, right? And it's not, they didn't hear, they would feel the pressure waves of the sound moving through whatever, you know, probably liquid substance they're in. And so that's one of the oldest, and one that every cell in the body, like when my daughter was gestating in my ex-wife's womb, we played a device, I can't remember the name of it, but it played random sound strings, and we started about week 16, so that, you know, it's speakers on the abdomen, et cetera. And then, of course, we played Mozart and the other things. But this was specifically designed for random sounds, so that in the womb, children that have this, they can't really hear it till later on, but they're processing that sound at the cellular level. They have lower startle responses. They're calmer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So sound can be very impactful. One of the things that we find, though, with people with brain injuries in particular, or serious neurological dysregulation, is that sound itself is not always sufficient to really help much.
Okay. And what about with the, you talked about nerve damage and neuropathy, along with these, I think the phrase used was high energetic medicines. What role do plant medicines play in supplementing, I guess, or complementing that? Because that's been one of the, for people with severe CTE, especially people with traumatic brain injury, one of the therapies that I've seen work pretty well is heroic doses of psilocybin, and it's because it sends massive amounts of energy back into that part of the brain. The brain is just for, we're not going to get into the weeds here, but the brain, just like everything else in nature, is optimized for efficiency. If it's sending energy to part of the brain and it's not performing well, it'll shut off that energy, right? It'll just like, hey, that's not working anymore, so we got to focus on what's actually working. But overloading energy into that part of the brain has been a pretty effective treatment for it, whether it's DMT or psilocybin or whatever else. Have you guys been using any of that in your research at all?
Yeah, so we stay away from what we call advanced molecules. But, I've watched, I remember the Green Berets coming back from Vietnam in the 60s and 70s, and they went down all of this path back then. We're finding that psilocybin in the studies that are being done doesn't work the way people think it works, that psilocybin really is mycelial. It's a fungi. It's a regulatory fungi. What it does is it helps, there's 400 to 500 trillion different living cells of at least 45,000 different species in your gut. And psilocybin regulates those so that they're working, using the psilocybin molecule to put them all in a consistent energetic state. And then what happens, all the experiential stuff you're having neurologically through the gut-brain axis is heavy production of the 90% of our hormones and neurotransmitters and neuroregulators that are created in the gut, not in the brain. So you're getting a flood of, what you should have been getting regularly, because psilocybin is putting this massively complex community in your microbiome into a coherent state.
Okay.
Through the psilocybin molecule.
So it's more helping with, managing is not the right word, I guess, organizing. You know what I mean? It would be like bringing in a good project manager for your gut as a factory system. Yeah. It makes sure that everybody's, I hate to say it this way, right, because of what the hell's going on in the world, but it puts the gut, that massive community in the gut that does all this complex, millions and millions and millions of complex molecules that are produced there, waste material removed, et cetera. It puts them on a wartime footing where they're all producing, right? They're all lined up, oriented, producing the things that the body really needs, and extracting waste better, and waste products and downstream metabolites, et cetera. Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's people think it's when you explain to people, or even just mention that most of the endocrine regulators and neural regulators are created in your gut, people look at you like, oh, I didn't know that. Yeah. And I guess we've never, I mean, it was, I don't remember ever being taught that in school, actually. And I've been to quite a lot of it. But of course that's how it works, right? I mean, that's where all of the energy goes into your body, except for the sun, right? But the energy that you actually consume, it all goes into your gut. So of course that's where it happens. Where else would it happen? There's nowhere else for it to happen.
We are vehicles for that community, right? And there's a lot of arguments being made now that the brain is not in the skull, and it's not even the enteric brain that wraps around your organs. Our actual brain is that 400 to 500 trillion living, that community of 400 to 500 trillion living beings in the gut that drives us around like a truck. Or Prius, depending on what you are.
I guess it would be an EV in that regard. Although there is waste material where as an EV. So, what have you seen in the way of breakthroughs? Like there are people who go on, my show, bigger shows than ours. They have their own social media platforms that talk about stuff surrounding this quite a bit. What's new? What's new in the ecosphere of this new form? I say new form of medicine, but that's not really what it is. It's more, it's more a new form of understanding biology than it is medicine specifically.
Correct. Yeah, actually, I think that's the best way of saying it. It's a better recognition that we are a collection of a very complex collection of hundreds of trillions of cells of different cell types that all have to work together as a community for us to function. What we're finding as well is that there's three tiering. There's the biomolecular layer, there's the bioelectric layer, and then there's neurocog, neuropsych that emerges out of that. More and more, we're finding that life is the bioelectrical. It's not the biochemical. That you can't reduce it down to chemical processes. It's the bioelectric fields, and then the complex interactions of those bioelectric fields is what, emerges as our, being and living. We can go in now because we have the sophistication of the tools, and we're recognizing more and more and more that this bioelectric, supremacy, and we can more and more and more directly map those individually to the individual, and then literally go right in and adapt the bioelectric, which then forces, not violently forces, right, but it puts the cell into biomolecular state changes that repairs itself, gets itself back into the right orientation. And then from there, we're getting vastly better neurocognitive, neuroemotive regulation. So to the question you asked about DMT and psilocybin and those types of things, again, and I've seen all of that, except for the DMT. I don't remember that one so much when I was young. That's come along later. I always wondered who the hell was so high they thought, let's go lick that frog's armpit.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Like, I don't know how high you got to be to, give me a second. So what we're finding is we're having vastly better reactions with much less side effects and risks, because plant medicine stuff doesn't come without risks, not so much molecularly or toxicity, but psychologically. I've watched guys, I've watched a guy develop a God syndrome more than once. I've watched people go into terror and fear place. So for all the good that it does have, we don't talk about the times that it doesn't have any good effect, and sometimes that's very deleterious. So we're able to go in, we're able to impact things more directly without the side effects, without the toxicity. What we're also finding is guys are able to get off drugs, right? The neurotropics and the SSRIs, et cetera. And then what we're finding is the treatments that people are receiving actually last, meaning there's a fundamental change, error correction happening at the cell level that lasts, that endures.
Yeah, I think that you mentioned what is effectively what I think is going to be the future of medicine and health in general, and that is bespoke treatment, right? Yes. As we learn more, like we're now 20, what was it, 99, I think. So we're 26 years into having mapped the human genome, and now we're doing stuff. We're understanding more about what you said before, the 4 to 5 trillion separate organisms, not separate each one of them, but dozens of organisms, 4 to 5 trillion individual units inside of your gut. Right, so 400 trillion, yeah.
to 500.
Yeah, so you're trillion, like, yeah. you're it is a very complex system, right? But the yeah. It's a complex system, but the rules are the same, right? So the rules, it's just like physics. Like you look at a star system or a nebula or something like that. You look at the edge of a black hole, the event horizon. The physics are the physics, right? The conditions change quite a bit. So that's why you have to treat them all individually. And now we're getting more and more capable of doing that. I think with AI and even mRNA, which we can talk about in a second, I think there's some, like, forget about vaccination stuff. That's stupid. Prophylactic stuff will come in different forms, I think. But mRNA, I don't think was ever meant to be a vaccine. We could just jump into that. Like, AI will make it easier to put in the elements of somebody's individual construction and decide what the best treatment or prophylaxis or just diet, lifestyle, whatever, right, for them. That'll certainly be a thing. But I wanted to ask you about mRNA, because the purpose of it was always to do this, right? Cancer is like mitochondrial breakdown. There's something gets wrong with the DNA and it starts killing itself. It starts replicating in a stupid way or whatever, right? There's a bunch of different ways to say that, but being able to go into a human body and extract a good piece of DNA and then the bad piece of DNA, and training some kind of module, in this case it would be mRNA, to go in and repair that bad DNA, is what it was invented for in the first place. Unfortunately, I don't know if anybody will ever trust it again because of this bullshit that they pulled. And used it in a way that it was never intended to be used. I don't know if people will ever try. It'll probably take 10 to 15 years of active use and results before the general public will actually believe it. And it's a fucking travesty, frankly, because people are going to die from cancer because of that. They will die because they don't want that treatment.
Right. So everything that you just said is medicine 2.0 and not medicine 3.0.
Mm-hmm.
So what we're finding is cancer is not a biochemical thing. Cancer is bioelectric. And this is work that's being proven in Michael Levin's lab and others. Cells bioelectrically have to remain in communion with other cells. Let me take one step back. Are you familiar with PSO, particle swarm optimization?
No. Explain that.
Excuse me. Hold on a second.
Yeah, take your time.
Cat doesn't jump up here. Right. So particle swarm optimization, helps us model the movement of flocks of birds where they don't collide with one another. And there's thousands and sometimes tens of thousands of these birds, or swarms of fish, right? How is that, with these very small little brains, with limited sensory organs, no Pelletor comm system, right? Linking them all up as a team. How do they do that? Well, it turns out there's some these very complex systems and actions are governed by maybe sometimes 2 or 3 very simple rules, right? Okay. So at the cellular level, right, at the single cell, because we begin as a single cell, when a cell is on its own, when it's isolated, one of these simple rules like PSO kicks in, and it needs to replicate because it needs to be in communion with another, a community of cells.
Yeah. And let me stop here for just a sec. I've said this before to people. I just want to remind everybody that the average person who is active and eats well, every cell in your body is different than the cells that were there somewhere between 2 and 2.5 years ago. Sometimes a little bit longer, but usually it's about in that range.
Some of them a few days.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So it happens constantly, and like parts of your body you're replicating every few days, but your entire body, to include your brain and your teeth and your eyeball, everything, right?
10 years.
The veins.
10 years at the most. All soft tissue, all of the soft tissue, at least every 4 years is 100% replaced, and then even the densest bone is within 10 years.
Yeah. So it's like, think of it, I just want to set the stage for this. Think of it in this way. We think of ourselves as a body that's the same all the time, walking around, this is me, this is who I am. In reality, that's not how it is, right? So, and in the places where you most likely get cancer, lymph nodes, soft tissue, stuff like that happens, especially melanoma, which is still the most common form of cancer, that stuff's replicated. The skin is every couple of days in some cases, constantly. The outer dermal layers. So
constantly.
Like this engine that you're talking about, where there is a communicative network to keep everything regulated, that is got to be one of the most important things you can do. Yeah.
So when I was going to do my doctoral studies, this is what I wanted to do it in, was a quantum signaling network, a error correction and security network with cells. And Dr. Tannick said that we just didn't have the way to measure it at that time. And we still don't at that level, but we're finding the Markovian, finding the signatures of it. So point is that when a cell is out of communion with the other cells, meaning it bioelectrically not in the same resonance with the other cells, it immediately goes into replicate mode. And because it's the progenitor of the cells that it's replicating, and as it's replicating itself, none of those cells are in communion with the other cells around.
So it's like being on AM radio and you're a couple of degrees off to the right. You're getting some information, but It's staticky, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And so in this case, what do? You just replicate more radios, try and clean the signal up, but it's not working. So
basically what you're doing is creating more bad cells at that point.
Correct. And then those cells can, if they got a source, right, energy source, food source, and can force other cells to extract their waste. They don't have to force, but meaning they have a viable environment to continue to replicate, they will continue to replicate, hence cancer. So what we're finding is that you can go in bioelectrically and put those cells back into the right frequency ranges, the right frequency pairs, that they're back in communion. Now, cancer, you still got to, if it gets beyond a certain point, you're going to have to excise and do all of that.
Yeah. I mean, the amount of energy it would take to overcome big lumps like that would be dangerous in other ways, I would imagine.
And then you got apoptosis where they got to die back, and then you got toxins, and you got to, right? So sometimes in small cancers, right, that even if it metastasized, but they're small, they're polyp size, you can deal with that. Okay, so that's one piece that we're finding. I want to go back to the DNA piece in the mRNA. We are finding in bioelectrics that DNA really doesn't actually matter much. It's why they didn't get the efficacy in the try to slaughter the planet with the manufactured disease. It's why they're not getting the reaction. The bioelectric signals in the body can turn genes on and off. The genes and the system, because it's actually bioelectric, not biomolecular, it can turn genes on and off, this vast complex of genes. What we're finding with the genes is that they're blueprints and they're hard-coded data as to things that the cellular community has experienced in the past. So that when a protein production process is started for something the body needs, it can go walk down the microtubule to the DNA, look for some segment that has information related to that protein specifically, but elsewhere on the genome can find further information of under these conditions 3 billion years ago, cells had to produce, create the protein like this. And that's what we're finding more and more. So what we're coming to understand is DNA matters less and less and less than we thought.
So with things like CRISPR, which is gene editing, basically, like would, instead of doing procedural editing on DNA, RNA, using energy to do that would be quite a bit easier, probably easier, right?
Yeah, and it's instantaneous.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm trying to think of an analog for that, of applying energy to something to make it do something else. I mean, there's a bunch of I hate to quote Batman, but that in the first Batman movie for Christopher Nolan, where he made that fabric where when you applied energy it became rigid.
Exactly.
That's a real thing, right?
That's exactly crazy. Yeah. So I'll give you an example. There's a disease out there called phenylketonuria, PKU. Yeah. The only reason I can say it is because I helped a company do this and a researcher get this out there a couple decades ago. But PKU is a disorder where people can't process a certain protein. Forgive me, I can't remember what it is right now. They can't process a certain protein, but people need proteins, right? You need to ingest proteins. So what you do is you create an amino acid, and there's usually 2 or 3 proteins related that they can't process as well. So we would do there was a professor up at University of Oregon who developed a resin that would pull these proteins out of lactose, out of a milk, right? Lactoferrin, glycomacropeptide, and phenylalanine. Phenylalanine is the one. Okay,
and that's how you make lactate, which is lactose-free milk, basically.
Correct. Yeah, correct. So, and it's a very bad disease. It kills kids, kills people, right?
How similar is this to just lactose intolerance in general? Because that is more of like a digestive issue.
Yeah, well, that actually has more to do with your microbiome, and it has to do with where your ancestors come from.
Sure.
But the real big part of that is we didn't really have lactose intolerance for any of us with, European ancestry until in the 1950s, increasing through the 80s. They genetically modified cows to A1, A2 genetic type because the A1 gave them twice the milk load per cow.
Right.
Problem is we're not designed to process A1, A2 proteins. We're designed for thousands of years, co-evolving with cows, to process A2, A2. So a lot of lactose intolerance is because they changed the genetic composition of the cows, and therefore the proteins changed. Okay. But back to the comment, terribly sorry. He was having very good success in the recommendation but we needed to be able to extract more of this from the milk. So I did some research and recommended a couple of frequency pairs that we would introduce through the substrate that had the resin on it that was binding, and it increased the efficacy increased to 99%. Just by adding, the right electrostatic charge, you could pull more of these molecules, complex molecules out of the slurry. Well, the same thing goes on, in the body is introducing, because each one of our cells, hundreds of trillions of cells, right? So about 100 trillion roughly in the human body itself, and then 4 to 5 times that in the microbiome, which is on the skin, in the sinuses, and in the gut, right? Each one of those cells, even the simplest, the bacterium, prion, well, you hope you don't have prions, but bacterium, et cetera, each one of those is a vastly complex system, a biomolecular, biochemical system that maintains and fluctuates in a bioelectric field. Well, you can impact that bioelectric field pretty easy, and that adapts all the biochemical stuff.
Is there any, could this kind of technology be used to reverse some of the more debilitating effects of aging? I'm thinking of recreation of collagen, reversing macular degeneration or osteoporosis, or any of these things that there's aging and then there's aging, right? There's aging that debilitates you to some degree.
Yeah, so great question. Some of the best work that comes out of this, and I'm working with a doctor right now, Dr. Todd Overkaitis, specifically in this area and domain. When you couple photonics, so specifically laser tuned certain color wavelengths, and then lensing and how you do the lensing, et cetera, and we use V cells, so very small embryonic like stem cells, which come out of your own serum, so they're your own stem cells, comes out of your own blood. We energetically charge using the photonics those stem cells. So we're giving them a higher energy charge than they would normally have, which also activates them because they're in a quiescent state when they're in the blood. Then we reintroduce the stem cells into the body, and then using the laser, depending on what system in the body we're trying to impact because of degeneration, maybe a genetic issue, et cetera. Then we use the laser across the dermis, pointing towards the dermis to help create an energetically charged pathway to that region of the body. And usually there's more than one that we have to impact.
Like digging a man-made tributary from one body of water to another almost, but it's energy.
Yeah, how I see it is more like military guys, right? And we've got friendly lines, and we've got the border between friendly and enemy lines, and then we got enemy lines, and we need to get resources and information to some guys that are behind enemy lines.
So it's more like DR8 reel then.
Yeah, I have to explain that.
DR8 is the stupid wire cables we used to use for comms back in the day.
Yeah. So in this case, though, I don't. It's more sophisticated than that. In this case, there are different elements along that pathway that they're going to have to pass. So we got a couple guys who are couriers, right? And they're carrying something, and we got to get it to the guys behind lines. We can't broadcast it out, et cetera. So there's a message that goes down to all the, like Saving Private Ryan, the movie, right? So there's a message that goes down to all the different elements that's, hey, keep an eye out for these guys, whatever they need, pass them through. And oh, by the way, everyone who's being, every stage that they go through, those folks need what they have. And it's another message of, yeah, don't take this. This isn't for you. We need this over here.
Okay.
Right? So it works more like that. Where most of this work is happening, though, back to your question, is in longevity studies and longevity work.
Okay.
Right. And everything from brain injuries to cancers to sustained injuries to degeneration of bone, et cetera, et cetera.
So, yeah, I mean, one of the things that's happened over maybe it's been longer in your field, but one of the things that's become more public lately over the last 5 years or so is a cessation of the use of the word lifespan in lieu of, or instead of, you're using now health span, right? Like how long in your life are you healthy? Like you can live 90 years, but if the last 20 are in hospice care, who fucking cares, right? Yeah. So it's like, to me, it's more of, this isn't necessarily the case anymore. There's a couple of places. I think they call them blue zones, if you're familiar with that. One of them is Okinawa, I believe. But in Japanese culture, longevity is a big deal. And I don't know that it's prioritized necessarily. It was just an effect of the certain kind of like staying active throughout their older years, eating the right types of food and such, getting a lot of sunlight. But there's a couple of places, there's like 5 places on Earth that have the most 100-year-old people that are still functional.
Okinawa.
Yeah, they're called blue zones.
Okinawa is the highest in the world.
Yeah, Okinawa's been the highest for as long as I can remember, actually. And it still is, even though I think Japan's lifespan is going down because their food is getting fucked up now. It's like just as processed as China now. But Okinawa's not like that. They're kind of off on their own thing. So we've gone from saying lifespan to health span now. So this idea of longevity isn't just about, like, you don't want to be Jimmy Carter, you know, frozen in a position for the last couple of years of your life or whatever. Like you're actually trying to get the most quality years of life you can.
Yeah, I want to be able to determine my own vote.
Yeah, no shit. Yeah, yeah.
I don't want to be trundled out on some bed looking like Nosferatu was just dug up, and then people saying, "Look, he voted for so and so."
Yeah, I
feel horrible for the man, by the way.
Yeah.
Right? That's not me. You know, I'm not a fan of. I was never a fan of Carter, even when he was president and I was younger. But that was just abuse. That should never have happened.
Yeah, that was pretty brutal. Back to the medicine. Is this the thing you're describing? Is red light therapy that people are using anything like that, or is that just superficial?
Okay, so another great question. Red light therapy. There's Dr. Jack Cruz, great. And you sent a message earlier on Twitter about some guest looking for guests. Jack Cruz is somebody I think you should probably have on.
That's Kruse, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, correct. Okay. Yeah, correct. The German spelling. Or Kruze.
Cruz. Okay.
Yeah. Give me a second. Red light is actually absolutely essential. There's another thing I would look at. It's called the electric universe theory. Which is more and more and more demonstrating that it solves all the problems with the standard model of physics.
Which came from here in Austin, Texas, by the way. Steven Weinberg, I believe, was the guy who won the Nobel Prize for that.
Yeah.
Here at UT Austin.
Yeah. I didn't know that, actually, so interesting. But I would look at the electric universe, and I would look at Dr. Jack Cruz. The articulation there is that early life, we had much more red sun, and we're bathed much more in red light. Dr. Cruz talks about and demonstrates, and it's being demonstrated in other labs, et cetera, that even in the brain, there's bioluminescence, that actually our cells are communicating energetically and high energetically, not just with bioelectric signaling, but also bioluminescent signaling. And to that, melanin, I believe it's melanin, seems to work much like a semiconductor in the body. It's throughout the body. It's got the highest concentrations in the brain, though, and it primarily works in the red wavelengths. So red light, absolutely essential. It's also essential why you need early in the morning at sunrise to look at the sun for 5 minutes, not look at the sun, but you know what I mean? Yeah. Look at the horizon, because you're going to get red light because of the angle of the sun. And then at night, just before the sun, as the sun's going down, you want to do the same, because you're going to get the right wavelengths of red light from there. The only detractor is that a lot of the red light manufacturers and producers, that light's not in the right frequencies. It's not in the right, doesn't have the right intensity, et cetera, et cetera.
So there's like a face mask that some people wear that I think the purpose is to regenerate collagen or something like that. I believe that's the purpose of it. I don't know.
Yeah, most of the stuff works, but it doesn't work in the way they think it does.
Yeah. Okay. I was just curious about that. This electric universe. So a lot of people have been, Huberman talks about that all the time with the sunlight in the morning.
Yeah. He and Jack, Rick Rubin,
Yeah,
the music guy.
Yeah,
Okay.
they just did a podcast. He and Jack just did a podcast together.
Yeah.
Huberman did, I think,
Yeah. So
not
they
too long
did.
ago.
That's right. Yeah. I think maybe a year or 2 years, but there's two of those. I would say that the first one is absolutely essential, an absolutely essential watch.
Yeah, I'll check that out too. I've seen one of them. I didn't know there was a second.
Yeah.
So we're talking about energy and resonance and such, and resonance is a word that's coming up now a lot in describing interpersonal communications. And I know that's a leap for a lot of people, right? We think of ourselves as like a fully assembled automaton, right? But in reality, that's not necessarily true. Like it's actually demonstrably untrue that that's what that is.
Yeah.
So
No, it's yeah. We are ourselves a collective. We ourselves have problems when we get out of communion. Bioelectric, biophysical. We share an immune system, literally, right? So herd immunity is literally our sharing an immune system because we're in concentrations with one another.
It's a good example of herd immunity, actually. Not just the way we think of it as herd immunity from different pathogens, but psychological herd immunity, right? Which, some of the things that attack that, things like, just broader gaslighting, but what Noam Chomsky called manufacturing consent is an attack on that. Think of it as a virus that's trying to overwhelm the immune system. And then, you map that back onto yourself. And you think about all these different things. And it seems like, and this is the case in a lot of ways, from the way we're structured to the way we perform and exist on different planes, from energy to resonance or whatever, that they all kind of look the same. You know what I mean? Like if you look at neural pathways under a microscope, it looks alarmingly like the cosmic web, right, of galaxies. Like the structure of things appears to be the same no matter how large they are.
Electric theory universe explains why that is. And it's that everything, and this gets back to the hippy dippy stuff when I was on the commune as a kid. And, when I was the only one on the commune who was a fan of Nixon, let's just say, give me a second. Electric universe actually explains that and articulates. And it's that everything at every scale, from the subatomic all the way up to the scale of the universe, is all electric fields, electromagnetic fields, and electromagnetic ley lines and field lines. And that's why we see this Mandelbrot-like expression of things from the smallest scale, the smallest expression of that algorithm, all the way up to many billions and trillions of times that algorithm being applied against itself. There was something you articulated there that I wanted to touch on, but it's gone out the other side of my head.
Well, I'm sure it'll occur to you again. So, yeah, the structure of these things from large to small kind of makes a lot of sense. If you think about, we're talking about the physical world, even if it's, unseeable energy-wise, the physical world. But it makes its way into, I guess you could call it metaphysical, like the way religion and philosophy has been. They've been for thousands of years, as long as we've been able to speak. Cloverleafed around some of the same things, trying to explain things like the physical forces. The first way we explain those is we just assigned a god to each one of them. And then no matter how they've been explained, gods get credit, Mother Nature, energy, the universe, some series of gods, whatever. They're all describing the same thing with inarticulate or inexact or just undiscovered so far language, I guess you could say, right? But we're really speaking about the same thing.
Absolutely. The only thing that's changed is our ability to test things physically, right? So
which is what science is.
Which is exactly what it is, right? What did Einstein say when he was coming up with the theory of general relativity? He was like, I was trying to prove God.
Yeah. And it took him 14 years after, right? The miracle year was 1905, but he wasn't able to actually test it until 1919, after World War I ended.
Yeah. And even now we're finding that maybe most of his stuff was wrong.
Yeah, a lot of it.
Right? Which is okay, though, because it gave us a great understanding. But I want to go back to the immune system. And you just brought up religion, et cetera, right? And this to the post I made yesterday about we are English and we are a civilization. Complex systems are error correction systems.
Right.
By nature, right? By the very nature, complex systems emerge as dissipative structures as error correction systems, complex, sophisticated error correction systems. And we all participate in those. From our physical immune system, which is ludicrously complex individually, much less across, your family, your coworkers, the people that you're physically in proximity to. Bioelectric fields, that electromagnetic dipole magnet that we are generates a field that goes out over 20 feet. When people get within 19 to 25, 26 feet, depending, those bioelectric fields start to regularize between the two. When you get within 6 to 9 feet, 3 to 6 feet actually, but it starts about 9 feet, human brain waves start to synchronize, right? So what are these things? These are very complex, sophisticated error correction mechanisms. Well, to your point, the greatest error correction mechanism of a people is their civilization, is their culture, their history, their linguistics, right?
It's that think of that as like the gravity that holds everything together, where the ideas like honor, respect, loyalty, beginning at the smallest level, which is your family, and then getting larger as your community, larger still as your country, and then largest as all people, effectively acting as prophylaxis against psychological pathogens. I mean, that's literally how it works.
It's an immune system. Yeah, it's our social immune system, our civilization, and there are all kinds of interesting peoples around the world, but historically there have been very few civilizational people. As much as we talk about the Iranians, et cetera, they're Persians. They are a civilizational people. That's why they're still here, despite the fact that the second coup the United States CIA did in 1952 was Iran, right? Yep. They're still here. The Russians are still here, despite the fact that we funded and sent Trotsky and Lenin into Russia specifically to bring communism about, and we bankrolled Lenin and Stalin to destroy Russia and the Russian civilization. It didn't work. They survived. They're still here.
Yeah, now that's why a lot of people, like Putin is kind of a dick and he comes in for a lot of heat, but he is a cultural Russian that is trying to reestablish Peter the Great's fucking Russian empire, for lack of a better phrase, because of culture, not because of money or land or any of that shit.
No. Yeah, no, he's restoring that error correction system that has allowed the Russians to survive the Mongols, the Germans, China's another one of these civilizational people. They've been invaded how many times? Right? And every one of the invaders that comes in within 80 years, they become more Chinese than the previous dynasty. Yeah. Right? Why? Because the civilization, the error correction system that is there and that is the immune system of their civilization and culture is so strong and powerful that it's the oldest on earth, so it's still extant. In America, everybody keeps talking about, Rome and the days of Rome, et cetera. It's like, well, okay, great, but we're not Romans. We're English.
Yeah.
And English isn't an ethnicity. I mean, the English culture and civilization that developed out of Alfred the Great, Edward the Elder, and Athelstan, and then was carried on through until even after William the Conqueror came in, right? That was a mix of ethnicities. That was Britons and Celts and
Danish.
Gales and Jutes and Danes and Frisians. And barbarians. In fact, English is actually Old Frisian, right? It's an old Germanic language. But what Alfred the Great saw was, what he set in motion was the error correction system that is the English civilization. And it's still with us.
Yeah. And it took a lot of forms too. I mean, like if you think about the systems that they've had, like feudalism, for example, it was still, regardless of the fact, and I would agree with it, the fact that it was an abusive system, but it was still an honor-based system, right? Like you have to, whatever system you have has to have some kind of, I guess, noble intent associated with it, whether it's actually noble or not, or it's a guise for something else. You have to have that. I think people generally want to be part of something, and they want that thing they're part of to be good, right?
So think of your immune system and all the complex, component pieces of your immune system, white blood cells and T cells and, all these complex components to our individual immune system, much less our collective immune system. When those component pieces don't see the host as this greater entity, this thing that, needs to be protected and kept alive, that immune system can turn on you. That's how you get autoimmune diseases, et cetera. Well, the same thing happens in a culture and a civilization. You have to have a thing that is greater and larger than individuals, that is more than land and ethnic groups, and you know what I mean? It's got to be something that's...
I mean, even the Vikings were ethnically disparate, we're finding now with archaeological findings, archaeological digs.
Yeah. And Viking is a verb, right? It's not a noun. So the Scandinavians are a mixed group of people, absolutely. Yep. But what came out of Wessex initially, and what would become England, right? The English is one of those civilizations that's gone through many changes, complete invasions. We've been invaded, substantively since Alfred the Great twice. 1066 with William the Conqueror, and despite everything that the Normans did and brought about, they only strengthened the English civilization. They only made it vastly more sophisticated and complex, and that's not to give them a pass for right, but those are my ancestors on both sides of my family, right? But then in 1685, we were invaded again at the invitation of our own parliamentarians and industrialists. And William of Orange came over in 1685 with an army and a Stuart daughter. And for all intents and purposes, well, and in reality, invaded us again. It made us, overwhelmed our leadership, was put on the throne as a paper king so that the parliamentarians and the industrialists could be in control. And we've had this paper king on the throne ever since. However, and these are all Germanic, these are Germanic peoples, and Germans and English are not the same. And we've been enemies for thousands of years, for 1,300 years or so. The English civilization's still here. It still survived. I suspect also, because this was 1685, I suspect also a good number of the people who came to the Americas were people loyal to the actual Plantagenets and to the Stuarts and to England and to Scotland as part of England and Wales as part, not necessarily subordinate, etc., but as members of the English civilization, even though the Welsh still speak their language, which I can't understand at all.
No one can.
Right, yeah. Point being, and I also suspect that some of the hard push for the revolution in the United States, the Civil War, was some of those that were rising up against this fake king, this fake German king sitting on the English crown, were like, well, we don't have to be loyal to that guy. He's not legitimate anyways.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because John Adams, who considered himself a good writer, but not necessarily a good orator, but he became at least an orator, if not a good one. Often referred to himself as an Englishman. If you look at some of his criticisms of the crown, it's like, we consider ourselves natural Englishmen, and the fact that you're not representing us well is what we're angry about, not the fact that we just want our own country. And then, especially after the Boston Massacre, defending Sergeant, I can't remember his name off the top of my head now, I think it was Brown or something like that, defending those British troops, and then still having the edict come down from the king that all new trials were going to be held in London. It's like, all right, dude, what the fuck? It's interesting what you're talking about to me, with not just the culture and its sustainment over time, but the fact that the culture gets challenged militarily on a regular basis. Sounds a lot like exposure to inert or natural pathogens that make our immune system stronger, right? So it isn't just the culture itself, it's also that the culture needs to be challenged from time to time.
Correct. And the greatest challenge that we have is always from within, right? The cancer is from within. The members of our communities that have fallen out of communion with the body, with the whole, right? And are trying to replicate themselves, with ideas and concepts and linguistic constructs.
Well, right now it happens to be Marxism, but it could be
Marxism.
It could have been anything, and in sociology we would call it societal decay, right? And one of the hallmarks of societal decay, almost like broken window theory, is that people stop treating the culture like it matters, and it just naturally decays after that.
Yeah, so that's exactly the point. And that's what they have to do, right? If you want to destroy a powerful enemy, you have to destroy them from within. We know that as military guys, right? How do you do that? Well, you've got to deny them the recognition that they are in civilizational peoples if you're trying to do this, right? If you're trying to do this to a civilizational people, the thing that you have to attack the most is their ability to even recognize that they are a civilizational people, not an ethnic group, not a protected group, not a religion, not occupiers a certain geography, but they are descendants and direct descendants of the civilization itself.
Yeah.
That they live in all those subconscious ways. We live a code. Well, that code is English, and it is unique in the history of the world. We have to remember that.
Yeah, you're in this regard, what you're describing, and you can see it with the assimilation that happened in England, in China, and so on, and
Russia,
and what's actually happened. What happened here for the first, let's say, 200 years of our existence was that your ethnicity and even your nationality, to some degree, wasn't the relevant point. It was your acceptance of the culture, right?
You're English.
Yes.
We were all English, whether we were Scots Irish, Ulster Irish, right? We might hate we might, like good children, hate our parents and be angry with our parents, and we might, fight amongst ourselves as a good dysfunctional family does. But when we were truly challenged by the outside, by the French, by the Spanish, by the Germans, by whomever else, we came together. We set aside those petty differences. It's just like it's a family. And our family is that family, not because of our ethnicity. Our family is that family because of two reasons. We have a shared code, civilizational code that's immensely complex and 1,300 years old. And the progenitors of that go back earlier, right? That's unique to us. And we share a language. And all that complexity of language, right? And language, too, this is actually Chomsky's work as well, right? The language itself is like mathematics. It has no basis in reality whatsoever. It's the linguistic structures, the metaphors, the unique ways in which our society and civilization shares complex information in simple statements and simple concepts and ideas that error correct across centuries, a millennia or more,
and in a way that's so complex. I mean, people, it's a shared language, but there's something like 3,500 dialects of English just in the United States. Right.
Yeah.
So you're talking about a bunch of different colloquialisms that all get combined into one data set, essentially, right?
Yeah.
And one of those things. One of the things,
we call it orthogonality, by the way. Sorry, but we call it orthogonality. Yeah.
And one of the hallmarks, like I before I mentioned things like honors, respect, loyalty, and stuff like that. And even in those regards, those are individual ideas. They kind of every now and again you see an amalgamation of them in a societal principle, something like noblesse oblige, which is
oblige.
Yeah, this idea that people that are privileged in any way, regardless of what it is, are honor bound to act with kindness and generosity and nobility towards anybody that needs it, right?
But that's a misunderstanding, actually. Noblesse
Okay.
oblige is the French, not the Latin. It's a French word.
Okay.
And noblesse oblige actually means the obligation of the nobility. It isn't to be nice. It isn't to do horse racing and bring. What the obligation of the nobility is, and this gets back to something that's uniquely English, okay? Uniquely English, is the princes have an obligation to stand and fight for their people.
Right. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense.
Stand and fight. Now, you also don't want to lord it over people, and you need to be, they're your people.
Yeah.
Your children in a way, right? You don't lord it over your children, you don't, et cetera. But the obligation of the nobility, which is what has been stripped, these ancient concepts and ideas by the merchants and parliamentarians. But this is also something that's uniquely English, is the barons, and how many times the barons went to war with one another, with the crown.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, that's where the
foreign
Magna Carta
invaders.
came from, right? I mean, King John had to
Correct.
basically purchase the loyalty of especially the northern barons.
Well, they defeated him.
Yeah,
They had defeated him twice. And that's all of that comes down to one man, William Marshall,
Yeah, William Marshall. Yep.
Lord Pembroke.
Yep. And he was
Right.
like King Louis was getting ready to invade, and they're like, King John's like, "Won't you fight for me?" And he goes, "No, but we'll fight for England."
Yes,
Right.
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And you are not England.
Yeah, yeah. And it was the first
Right.
time it was the first time in Western history, at least, that the power of a king was limited by a document that they signed. It was the first time ever that happened.
Yes.
Now, the levelers came along later on with an agreement of the people that kind of led to our Constitution later, but that was the first time, and it only applied to the barons, but it applied to somebody other than the king, which was unique at that time and kind of wild, actually. I posted something earlier on Twitter about this stuff. So we talked about John Adams was one example, but he wasn't the only one that considered themselves an Englishman, right?
They all did.
Yeah.
They all did, all of them, right? They for years and years ahead of time, they were seeking the redress of grievances, genuine grievances,
Right.
through the courts.
in the same way that the barons were in the
Correct.
13th century, right? I mean, it was the
Correct.
exact same scenario. So
Correct.
I write that we created this system to rid ourselves of kings, and what we got instead was a system where unelected authoritarian bureaucrats and corporations rule everything. So nothing has changed except for the assholes are more difficult to identify and get redress from.
Yes.
When somebody from the federal government, an unelected bureaucrat, sends an email to Meta and says, "Hey, I want you to censor this," right? It takes several years now, even in the digital age, to unpack and get redress on that. And in many cases, you never will. In most cases, actually, you never will. Whereas a king tends to be afraid of upsetting their people, right? Because bad things happen when kings upset their people. Now, there are good kings and bad kings, certainly, but in the back of their minds, like even in the Roman Republic with a smaller group of people, they were always worried that the plebs, I guess you could call them, were going to come over there and start slicing people's heads off.
Yeah, so Rome's a different issue. I wrote about this in the threads I did, the Praetorian problem, because until Constantine, the Praetorian, it's from Augustus, between Augustus and Constantine, the Praetorians were really in control always. And they would kill emperors, and they would kill their family members. And they were also, the Praetorians were also the guard for judges, some magistrates, governors, generals, et cetera, et cetera. So they were in control. In England in particular, unlike the absolute monarchy and the absolute rulership in France and other parts of the world, in England, there were strong barons, the strong princes, right? The dukes, the earls, the jarls, et cetera. Those were all accountable to their own people. And many of them, not many, but some of them were way more powerful than the king. Way more powerful than the king. The barons were the check on the king, not the people.
Right.
The check against the king, again, was the barons. But in order for the barons to be able to do that, they had to actually provide for their people. There had to be a solid, accountable relationship between them and their people. They needed to have productive land. They needed to have, productive economic systems. Feudalism is not what a lot of people believe, because the parliamentarians and the merchants who wanted to destroy the nobility starting in the early 1600s have been steadily feeding us a line of shit about what history was.
Yeah.
Right? But you had an accountable prince to where, it's called the pitchforks are coming. That's it's an old saying.
Yeah.
And so
feudalism, by the way, I don't want to sorry to interrupt, but serfdom ended in like the 1570s in England, and feudalism continued. I mean, we see it like I hate to invoke this, but you saw Downton Abbey. It was towards the end of World War I where it started to where it finally fell apart, right?
Correct.
That's when it finally fell apart. So you're talking about
47 of the houses. Yeah, apologies. Go ahead.
No, you're talking about well over 300 more years that it lasted after that in a way that was beneficial to a lot of people.
Yes. World War I was specifically fostered by the industrialists because they needed the labor, and to get the labor, they needed the princes to give up their people, and the only way to do that was to kill the princes. The only protections that people had were the princes, were the barons, the counts, the dukes, the earls, etc. In World War I, in the British system alone, 47 houses were ended because the heir died with no other heir in that family in the war, in World War I. It's the reason that the empires, the European empires, which I couldn't care less, we've been at war with Europe for millennia, and we need to get we English are not Europeans. We're frickin' English. We need to get our shit out of our head that we're Europeans, that our European culture. We've been at war with those assholes for thousands of years, for 2,000 years. Fuck them. I have European friends and family, and I'm right, but we're not Europeans. We are English. If we look at the enslavement of the people, all of these horrible things that have been happening, they all happened. They all took off at the end of feudalism, which was the death of all of the nobility. Right? Everybody who was born and raised from the time they were young to take care of their people, or they might get ripped out of their house at night. Yeah. Right? Were killed.
Yeah. So now we've exchanged them for politicians.
Well,
and can anybody say that that's a good thing? And
they're just actors. Yeah. They're just actors. They have no power, nothing. Yeah. They're there to take the blame for shit that they have no power and control over whatsoever.
Yeah. Yeah,
and we do the figurative pitchforks by, quote unquote, electing them out every 4 years, right? Which is a, metaphor for the pitchforks came.
Yeah.
But it's not real. It's, unless you have accountability where the people there's a prince, and that prince is responsible for these people and these lands and this economy, right? And that prince could be ripped out of his head, out of his bed one night by his people because he's screwing his people over. But more importantly, on the other side, that prince has the strength of his people behind him and that economy behind him, that he can go to war with the crown. He can go to war with, the parliamentarians, which is what the politicians are. Without that, you just have an unaccountable slaver system. This is why England fought the Europeans, why we fought the French, why we fought the Germans, why we fought these people for, and the Romans before, because we didn't want this unaccountable system, right? Because we watched, fortunately, from a bit of a distance, what was happening to the people, this total enslavement of the people.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you read Montesquieu talking about in the Spirit of Laws, when he's talking about separation of powers, if you map that onto the idea of feudalism, it seems a lot like federalism, right?
Yes.
Feudalism was the original federalism in a lot of ways because it gave that lower level organization the literal power to fight back against the top level organization, right?
Talk about states' rights.
Yeah,
in this case, it's prince's rights.
Yeah, that's where it began. So instead,
very good.
Instead, we've exchanged this for people that get elected not by us necessarily, but by money, right? Which means that we've infected the system with corporate interests. There's no there's no one-to-one accountability any longer. There can't be. And it's not just the politicians, by the way. We sold our souls. It's not just the politicians, by the way. It is the career unelected bureaucrats now. So we've got two layers of bullshit.
Yeah, well, so give me a second. That Dostoevsky saying, right, is that your sin is that you destroyed yourself for nothing.
Yep.
He was absolutely right. What we did is we sold ourselves to the industrialists. And then the industrialists put a regime and a machine in place to manage us. It's just all government is labor management. That's all it is. And it's horrible at it, right? It's like outsourcing personnel to ADP instead of having your own personnel department that's, that you're directly as the CEO and chairman accountable to and directly responsible over. The problem is we sold for some comforts and, quote unquote, quality of life and standard of living improvements, which I don't know how sick are people now, how unhappy are people, how many on antidepressants. We sold ourselves to the industrialist, and we failed to come to the defense of our princes and meet in that same time. Over the last 400 years, those industrialists and the parliamentarians have been denying us our own history, our own culture, our own civilization. We are an imperial people. We are a monarchical people. We are naturally designed to follow and to hold accountable a prince. We're designed, our whole civilization and society is based off of that, but we're denied it. So they can keep us, so we can get some baubles, right? I can have a jet ski and a little trailer and go out jet skiing. Of course, I'm in debt to, somebody for that. I'm paying, well, I'm not a private anymore, so I don't keep debt, at 29% interest rate, et cetera. And I don't chase strippers and all that anymore. Never really did anyways. But, the point is that we have got to remember that we are a civilizational people, one of the greatest civilizations in all of human history. We've impacted the world and in ways that no other civilization has. We have brought things to the world in the ways in which we think, these old ancient ways that didn't develop under the frickin' parliamentarians and under the industrialists, but under kings for 1,000 years, right? 1,300 years.
People that had an actual responsibility to people. And to be fair, and in a capitalist society, Milton Friedman said this, that your responsibility is to your shareholders, right?
Yeah.
Not necessarily to everybody. And that's probably how it should be. There should be competition between the two things. But, the problem with this, though, is that with the shareholder thing is that right now we have three massive unaccountable financial institutions that own stock in 90% of the companies. They are the shareholders. They're not just own stock in 90% of the companies, are the top three shareholders in 90% of the companies.
Correct. So this is the problem, right? We've taken the ways which we are, unfortunately, because of the nature of our English civilization, we are highly susceptible to this type of hijacking. We're highly, and why? Because there's few principles of our civilization. The number one is private property, number one. The number two is individual sovereignty. And related to both of those is freedom of expression.
And I would say they're all the same thing, because
they're all the same thing.
It's property rights, the rights of man, John Locke.
Correct.
The ultimate property, the ultimate right is property rights. The ultimate property is yourself, and the ultimate expression of that is your thought and speech. Yep.
Correct. Absolutely the case. That is what's different about the English civilization, as expressed by the Scots, by the way, and the Irish,
and the French,
Welsh,
even the French, even Montesquieu, even the French Reformation, embodied a lot of these ideas. So it got to those assholes.
Then it turned into slaughter.
It was right? It was that was a revolution. Shit. It reminds me, people often say stuff like, we fought a war in America to get rid of kings, and that's not necessarily true, right? I don't think that's true at all.
We tried to get the king's attention.
We gave that.
Was not compos mentis.
No, we gave him a decade and a half essentially to figure it out, and
even after the formal break and the Civil War become a revolution, even after, for the next century, there was this rapprochement. I mean, when the French came and said, well, help us fight the English, we're like, yeah, fuck you. We're English.
Yeah.
We're American.
George Washington said no, straight up said no.
Yeah, fuck you.
Yeah.
You're our enemy.
Yeah, so it wasn't, that's not what it was, right? I mean, I would assume that people in the 1790s viewed 80s and 90s viewed Washington as effectively a king, right? Like I don't think the idea of self-governance, I don't think the idea of self-governance had taken root the way it has today necessarily. And I'll remind people, that God, king, and country used to kind of be the phrase. Whether you believe in the religious part or not, it's not really the God part of God, king, and country is about your culture, right? It's about like
your civilization.
Yeah, the civilization, the thing that we all agree upon. And it's whether it's a bearded white dude in the sky or something else, it doesn't matter. It is a list of precepts that we all consider sacred, right? That's what it really is. And I remember from the first Gladiator movie, the good one, when Russell Crowe's character says a soldier has the advantage of being able to look his enemy in the eye, right? Yeah. And then he said there was something about being able to communicate directly with a king as well. That is something that really spoke to me even as a young man. That especially after I was, when I was on the way out of the military, as many of us were, completely disaffected because we had been sent on a fool's errand, right? Which I'm sure even it's happened a number of times with kings just over their fucking insecurities and stupid shit like that. Or
being misled. The kings too can be fooled and misled by their courtiers.
Yeah, it happens. It happens sometimes, and there's not much you can do about it. But I remember being extremely disaffected and thinking, how is this any different than before? The difference is now that I can vote this asshole out of office, but the people who actually did this, the John Boltons, they're still in government. The Podestas, they're still in government. All these people.
Or the chairman of Raytheon, who did the ride, so this is, I personally, and I've thought this since I was young, and more I see it. It's the novel I'm serializing, which is up on Substack and Medium now, as Rome Burns. I fundamentally believe that we are back in the age of princes now. What comes next is monarchy. Well, there's a further solidification into a new form of feudalism, which now it's not land-based, it's capital-based.
It's corporate-based,
Well, it's financial. It's where is that prince's money invested, right? In whom and into what industries, enterprises, et cetera, in which communities, and that's commingled with other investors, et cetera. So it's not a direct one-on-one person-prince relationship anymore. It's a little bit more complex than it used to be. But historically, the bureaucracies, the parliamentarians, the industrialists do exactly what they've done here, and that is that they turn on the princes. And then the princes realize, holy cow, we're actually undefensible because we don't have the people behind us. And I can't trust my security company, no matter how much money I pay them.
Yeah.
Right? Because they all come from one of three entities, right? And they still have loyalties there in all cases. I believe very fundamentally what we're seeing is a return to princely oligarchy and nobility and actual formal. We see that also in the family office structures, right? So how their wealth is structured for multi-generational protection and preservation. So, the wealth disparity stuff is not going to change. I'm not necessarily opposed to it, as long as there's enough for everybody and the whole pie is growing, right? What comes out of that, however, over time is that the princely houses, like we're seeing right now, what we're seeing with Trump getting into office and all these other things, is that the oligarchs are at all-out war. They're at all-out war. It hasn't gone completely hot in the U.S. yet. It's already hot in other parts of the world. What the hell is Ukraine about? That's oligarchs fighting it out, right? What winds up happening is there's some balance achieved in that conflict. The princes realize that they're going to constantly conflict with one another, and they need an arbitrator. They need somebody who can arbitrate between them, who's going to be given certain powers, certain capabilities that they subordinate themselves to, while that individual will never be allowed enough power to actually be the power. And that's a king. That's a king, historically.
Yeah, and that's... You mentioned... the security thing with people having different loyalties. This idea that Now they're to corporate interests when there used to be to princes. I mean this loyalty to princes was mutually assured destruction long before nuclear weapons was around, right? Were around rather. King John knew, for example, that William Marshall's people would come fuck him up.
Yes.
If they abused the Northern Englishmen, right? He knew that, right? And that just in and of itself is kind of like this is how everything in nature works, from big to small in physics, from big to small in sociology, and everything around. Think of a star. A star is a constant battle between nuclear fusion blowing up and gravity holding that star together, right? This is true in almost everything. Well, as far as I can tell, in everything that happens, right? There's always some counterbalance between power and nature's ability and will even to hold things together, right? And I think it's that natural balance is very important. It's very important. That's why, people in leadership positions should be. Certainly, you should have a sense of duty and honor and use that to the effect of helping your people. But also, you should fear fucking up, right? You should fear abusing them, especially. Failure is one thing, but abusing people is a completely separate thing, and you should be afraid of that. And people are no longer afraid of it.
Yeah, well, that's when revolutions happen, quite literally.
It is.
Right? Back to the civilization, very much what you're saying, right? There are always entropic forces trying to tear things apart. And there has to be error correction in complex systems, communities, networks, et cetera, that is the counterbalance to that entropic force, that constant entropy. And amongst humans, a species, collections of human species, as they go associate themselves together, that error correction is a civilization. That's what a civilization is. And very few peoples, I mean, we could look around the world. You and I have been in these parts of the world. Okay, great. You lived in this little crack in the mountains in Afghanistan or in this little island in the Philippines or wherever for thousands of years. Great. But you've never really developed anything or created anything, or there's no civilization there. You're just a people. Okay, great. No disrespect, but you're not a civilization. Those people that have developed a civilization, a substantive civilization that's error corrected across thousands, centuries, or if not 1,000 years or more. And the Chinese, they're at what, 4,500 years now? So, I mean, these things can go a long time. Without that error correction, which is your civilization, its codes, its concepts, its ideas, its language, that that are shared amongst everybody, every ethnic group that lives within the that's part of that civilization, every religion, all the different ways in which we define ourselves. And I'll go back to the early ones, the Welsh, the Irish, the Scots, the Britons, the Angles, the Jutes, the Danes, we were a mix right from the very beginning. But what brought us all together as a people, as the English, was this civilization. When you have dramatically different socioeconomic classes, the only way they can communicate and actually understand one another, because they live in fundamentally different realities, is through a shared civilization. It's the only way. It's the only thing that binds them together as a functioning whole and people.
And a good example of that is people that are suffering. For a very long time, the number one predictor of crime, now it's fatherless homes, but the number one predictor was always poverty, right? In English civilization, it was expected of barons to take care of impoverished people and to even, not just to take care of them, but to lift them out of poverty should they have the ability to do so. Now, when you map that onto, let's say, modern America, we look at power, and this is something I talk about on this show a lot, the responsibility of people to be their brother's keeper and not to rely on government to do it. When you allow people to stay in poverty, they will create parallel economies that are almost always criminal. Think of urban neighborhoods, but even before that, think of the Italian mafia, the Russian mafia, Irish mob, all this stuff that's happened throughout American history. That's what takes place if there isn't a civilization structure in place to handle that situation.
Dalrymple writes about this, right? The British psychiatrist. He wrote about this. He wrote a book, I believe it's called Life at the Bottom. And when you have when there is no direct connection between a people and their prince in a mutually dependent relationship, and there's an imbalance to where you wind up with a population of people that are less and less and less capable of contributing to this complex world that we're building for various reasons, and who become more and more dependent on handouts because there's no way for them to productively contribute. What winds up happening is you wind up with a subculture that is fundamentally increasingly removed from your civilization. It becomes its own, like cancer, right? It becomes its own community, cancerous community within your civilization. And the only way to bring them back, which we do when we're spinning people up to war, right? Because when we're spinning people up to war, what do? We can revert back to all those linguistic structures that we all grew up with in Boston to get people to go to war. So other than that, what do you have to do? You still have to foster that sense of civilization, being part of something that's much older, and we're all in this together, and we've got some work to do, and you're going to have to contribute, and sorry, we can't do handouts, we can't afford them anymore. And so to the point you're saying is we've tried to replicate all of these systems and structures that our princes used to do with governments and with bureaucratic systems and really with philanthropy. None of it works. None of it works. It works for the industrialists and the financial people to a point, right? We're now vastly in debt. So how well is it working, by the way? Because it literally failed 40 years ago, 1971. We defaulted, right? And the only reason we haven't had to deal with that is because we have unaccountable oligarchs and unaccountable bureaucrats, and we still had the martial military might and mass to force the world to keep buying our debt. Well, the rest of the world is saying, no, we're not going to do that anymore. We're not going to keep buying your bad debt. Okay, well, what comes next? How are we going to address this issue? How are we going to address this problem? It's not going to be through philanthropy.
No.
That doesn't work.
No, there's,
right?
Well, I mean, that's why the powers that be are trying their best to push a war with Iran right now.
Yeah, well, world war, because if we go to war with Iran, it's a world war. That's exactly the case, right there. And that's why you also got these folks out there telling the uber wealthy families that we need to dramatically drop the population or the planet's going to die. The planet's been hit by giant rocks bigger than cities, and it's survived that.
Yeah, about 450 million years old, it was hit by a rock the size of Mars, and we cannibalized that rock, became bigger, it blew off the crust, that accretion disk became the moon, and we're still here. So I think we're
planet's here, life's, you know what I mean? So it's like, I'm not sure we're going to kill the planet.
Yeah, I think the planet's going to be fine. The problem with all of this is that I think if you look at English civilization and the difference between kings and a feudal relationship versus American politics, one is clearly better in my opinion. People may disagree with that, but I think the way we used to do things was quite a bit better, frankly, and there were some adjustments we could have made to make it more feasible even for the modern age. The problem is, and always will be, succession, right? Because for every Augustus you get a Tiberius, a Nero, and a fucking Caligula, and that is unacceptable. So I don't know that there have been periods.
Constitutional monarchy addresses that, though.
Yeah.
Constitutional monarchy addresses it. The problem we have in the West right now is the Praetorians. We've allowed a Praetorian regime to emerge again, and they're in control.
Yeah. Is there a what we would call a light side Praetorian that's actually good? Should that be a thing? Like, if there's a World Economic Forum, or an Illuminati, should there be a good version of those things?
No. The problem is you have to have strong princes with their own house guard that are quite capable, that then get augmented by people, irregular forces.
Sure. By volunteers.
That's the only.
Right?
Yeah. No. Absolutely.
Which means you've got to actually convince them that your cause is just. Which means you have to provide services to them to buy their fucking loyalty instead of just demanding it at gunpoint, which is what happens in America right now. Correct.
Right? So unfortunately, when you have unaccountable systems, which is how the Praetorian emerged in Rome, right? You still had the senatorial system. Most everything was still managed through that. There was just an emperor. The problem that we find is that, and there's a guy. Sean McFate, I think's his name, at Georgetown. He did a video a couple of years ago called Billionaire Warfare, right? And he's touched on. I've talked to him a couple of times. He's a professor, so he's not comfortable touching some topics as far as they need to go. But the problem is that if you don't have a strong prince that with a large populace that's his people that he knows and he cares for and he takes care of, and there's a mutually beneficial relationship, and he has his own house guard, then there's no check, and you have to have multiple of those, right? That will come together in an alliance at some point to face the Praetorian. This is what wound up happening in Rome, in Byzantium. It's really why they split the empire, because the Western Empire and the Praetorians were just too strong. They like the mob, had infiltrated everything, and they were murderous. They would kill you. They were your security, right? Just like today, right? So who was in control? Well, it was the security. It was the Praetorians. And that's not just the guys with the gladius in the house. It was the banking guys and the folks. Okay.
It was the original deep state.
It was the original deep state. Yeah. That's exactly the case. Yeah. And it went on for 300 years. Yep. We're about 400 years into ours, right? In the English world, right? The English speaking world, we're about 400 years on. Well, Constantine had to come with his own army, his own supports, his own nobility, his own, and their military, their martial capabilities, et cetera, and defeat the puppet emperor, president, right? Had to defeat the puppet emperor and the Praetorians at the Battle of Milvian Bridge militarily and destroy them. And then whoever survived, and they hunted down a lot of those, were cast to the far extremes of the empire and said, if you ever come together again, we'll kill you, which they did, right? And that had to continue after Constantine. And that's where Byzantium started, right? And Byzantium went on for literally another 1,100 years until its own deep state snuck in.
I mean, the similarities between Constantine and whatever might come next are so, because right before Constantine, there was this, I guess, 20-year period almost of currency manipulation that happened.
No, everything's the same as today.
Like all the I've talked about this many times on the show before, but all the coinage in Rome was recalled. It was melted down and then filled with iron, and then the amount of actual silver or gold or copper reduced dramatically over the course of about 10 years. Yeah. And then I think it was Diocletian who even put out, it was the price edict. So they manipulated currency, and then they manipulated the pricing market after that. Everything that you purchase, literally every product you could purchase in Rome had a max number that you could charge for it. And what did everybody do? They just charged the max amount for it. It effectively ended whatever form of capitalism they had at the time. This has all happened before, and this
massively in debt, and the nobility was destroyed. Right, because the nobility, in order to sustain itself, had to sell lands and things to the
barbarians.
To the Praetorians, actually, because the Praetorians were the only one that had the funds.
Yeah. So I mean, all this has happened before. All this will happen again. I think is a quote from Battlestar Galactica, but it's true in real life too.
What a great reference. I love Battlestar Galactica.
Same, yeah.
The original.
Well, look, we got to get out of here. I appreciate your time today. It's been a great conversation. I think the arc that this conversation took from energy and medicine to sociology and philosophy and politics is proof enough that all these things are kind of connected. And that you have to have a pretty good sense of all of them to understand exactly what's going on. I thank you for coming today. I appreciate the time. Tell everybody where they can find you and all of your work and such.
Yeah, man. So Twitter, my name, EM Burlingame at Twitter. And then I'm going into this, how the new nobility is emerging right now and where it comes from in a serialized novel on Substack and Medium, both under my name. It's called Azarone Burns. Now I go into these things in fairly great detail, but hopefully in an entertaining story.
Right. Well, thanks for coming today, man. I really appreciate it.
All right. Appreciate it, Dan. You have a good one.
Yeah, you too. And thank you all for listening. This has been Citizen.